Good morning, church. If you would, please stand for the reading of God's word. We're going to be in Mark chapter 11, 12 through 33. Take it away. All right, Mark 11. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly, I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses." And they came again to Jerusalem. As he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?" And Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me." And they discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But shall we say from man?" They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." This is God's word. You may be seated.
All right. Well, let me just add my welcome to church. My name is Coppenrath. I'm the pastor here. So glad to have you all here this morning with us. And I want to just start by offering up an opinion to you guys. This is kind of my take that I believe that the sandwich is one of the greatest inventions in food history. Hopefully you guys have had a sandwich lately. You enjoyed that. We all have our favorites when it comes to... This is going to be a very food-heavy sermon, by the way, so just to let you guys know. For those of you who have never had a sandwich before, you start with a piece of bread at the bottom. You put some meat or some kind of content in the middle, maybe PB&J, maybe deli meat, whatever you'd like, and then top that with another piece of bread. And so separately, they're just ingredients, right? But when you put that all together, there's a sense of perfection that happens. There's a sense of completion when you bite into that sandwich. It just makes sense, right? This past week, Daniel Kaler, our family minister, had the audacity to ask me if I like BLTs. Do I like BLTs? Of course I do, right? I don't discriminate against any sandwiches. I was thinking about this. The East Coast really has a handle on sandwiches, I feel like, in a way that we don't on the West Coast. And one time I was in Philadelphia, and I was there with my friend Rob. And Rob and I, we enjoyed being there. We were just there for a couple of hours, 3 hours. And so what do we do in this great historical city? Do we see the Liberty Bell? Do we see Independence Hall? No, we try and eat as many Philly cheesesteaks as we can in 3 hours. True story. So we eat 5 chili cheesesteaks in 3 hours. Hey, don't judge me, all right? 5 chili cheesesteaks in 3 hours. It was awesome, okay? This is a safe place to share these things, right? Maybe you've been in New York City as well. If you've ever been in New York City, or if you ever go in the future, check out Carnegie Deli. Order the pastrami sandwich. It's like $40, but you can share it with 3 people. It's huge and awesome. And then probably what's next for me is like a lobster roll in New England somewhere. I've never done that before. Okay, so now that we're all like hungry and we're all like wondering what are we doing right now? What are we talking about at this moment? The reason why I'm talking about sandwiches is because we get to this really interesting format here in Mark that's super clear through this passage. One that we've seen before, actually, but Mark invites us to partake in a fig tree sandwich. It's a story about a fig tree, and in the middle, there's this huge incident at the temple, and then you follow it up again with more about the fig tree. And it takes all these ingredients that kind of seem a little bit mismatched in a way. When you layer them together, though, there's a cohesion. There's something that makes sense when you put it all together. And to be honest, I think that a lot of us, when we read this, it can go over our heads. It can maybe not feel like it's having anything to do with one another. I'm sure the disciples even felt that way because it's an odd series of events. If you guys look at Mark 11, Jesus curses at a tree, which doesn't seem like a very Jesus thing to do, but he does that. He goes in a church, he flips over tables, he yells at everybody, he drives everybody out, and then by the same way, on the way out of town, he looks at that tree that we encountered earlier, and he tries to teach this lesson and brings it all together for the disciples. Jesus is pretty fired up here. And it's important that we remember the context in which we find ourselves because this is the last week of his life. He's got some things to say. He has some things to point out and do that he realizes he doesn't have all the time in the world anymore. So he has to start getting a little bit more direct. And he is fed up in so many ways in this passage. He's fed up with two-faced hypocrisy. He's fed up with those who wanted to appear as godly outwardly, but really had no desire to be godly inwardly. And what angers him the most is this: the misuse of the temple, this place where people actually wanted and needed an encounter with God. They went to the temple to be with God, and on the last Monday of Jesus' earthly ministry on earth, he calls these guys out. And what we see is that they're not ready to listen. In fact, they start plotting even more so to take him down and to kill him. And so I hope that you and I are ready to hear and listen and to submit to the Lord's authority this morning. That's my hope for us. So let's look together at the start. This is a long passage. I have a number of points here, but let's look at Mark 11, verse 12. And this begins with this first point where we see Jesus picks a fight. Verse 12 says this: "On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, 'May no one ever eat fruit from you again.' And his disciples heard it." So the following day, this is Monday, meaning it's coming off the heels of when he went to the temple on Sunday. And Jesus had just rolled into Jerusalem. He's there for the first time. And on Monday, they did this day trip to Bethany. And on the way back, Jesus gets hungry. He has the munchies, right? And this is just kind of an awesome reminder, too, that Jesus is human. He's 100% human. He feels the same things we do. And so he's walking, he's talking, and he realizes, his stomach's growling. He's hungry. He needs a snack. And he sees this fig tree, and he says to himself, "I'm going to go over there and see if I can grab a bite." Now what helps here, you may know all about fig trees. I do not, and so I had to read up about these. Fig trees, apparently, there are two blooms to a fig tree. And so there's kind of the spring bloom and the fall bloom. And one of them is a good bloom as far as there's lots of fruit, there's lots of things to pick off that tree, and the other one not so much. And so this moment, which Mark actually points out in verse 13, is not the season for figs. And we can probably even think it's either just completely out of season or it had really bad figs or poor figs. Jesus sees this tree, and he gets his hopes up. I'm hungry, right? And I see this fruit tree, and it's like, wow. When it comes to food, we've all been there, no doubt, right? Sometimes, before where I worked in Glendora, there was this barbecue place in Azusa that me and my coworkers like to go to all the time, and I always would forget it was closed on Tuesdays for lunch, super random. Why are they closed on Tuesday afternoon for lunch, right? So you see the building, you park, you walk up, and your hopes are dashed because you're like, I wanted barbecue, but no, this is not available to me today. Who closes on a Tuesday, right? This is kind of what happens to Jesus. It's just like, hey, this is a fig tree. Like the whole job of this tree is to produce figs. And it's got nothing on it. Not one fig is found. A fruit tree with no fruit. So Jesus, because he's God, takes it up a level, and he steps back and he speaks to the tree. He says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And he kind of lays this curse, this kind of swear against the tree, and you have to kind of imagine some of the disciples are like, did he just talk to that tree? Do you hear that? Because I think he just talked to that tree. Okay, so this is kind of the first part of our fig tree sandwich. Let's hold that thought. Let's go back to part 2 and look at verse 15 for a second. Again, all this is related. All this is connected. It goes together. Verse 15, it says this. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them, saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when the evening came, they went out of the city. So just like maybe we needed some fig tree 101, let me remind you of what the temple is. We needed a reminder that the temple was a central location physically of the religion that was in Israel, right? The temple was a huge deal. And not only was it a huge deal in our minds and hearts, it was a huge building. It was thought to be about 1.5 million square feet. That's kind of what they determined the temple at being. That's kind of like if you put 4 Costcos in a row together, kind of in a quadrant. That's how big the temple was. So it was a huge Costco-sized building. It's massive. It's set up on top of this hill, and its walls are just like staggering to behold. You see this temple from anywhere in the city. And the temple itself is made up of multiple parts, okay? So it's not just one big empty space. You walk in, and there's an outer court, and there's an inner court. And in fact, we see here in Mark that Jesus is in this place called the court of Gentiles. Now, this is important, okay? Keep that in the back of your mind. That's where the non-Jews were allowed to go. That's the only place they could go, was the court of Gentiles. If they go any further, in fact, there's a rumor, one time, a Gentile dude went through there and he died, like immediately. Walked out of his space to the court of Gentiles, walked into the inner courts, and he died. So there's probably signs up, there's probably whispers in the courtyard. It's like, yeah, you walk through that door, careful, something's going to happen, right? So there's the inner court, there's the court of women. It wasn't women only there, but just like the Gentiles, they could only go so far as well. Then the court of Israel, where the men could go, but again, only so far, followed by the court of priests, and then finally the Holy of Holies, which is separated by this giant veil in the middle of the temple. The temple was a huge deal. It was a huge deal spiritually, but it was also a huge deal physically, and there was a decorum, there was a way to go around and walk around this place. Now, where Jesus is he's way back in the court of Gentiles. And here's what's happening, what's unfolding before his eyes. There's 2 things that are happening. Gentiles are coming from all over the place. They're trying to do 2 things. They're trying to, 1, pay their taxes, this annual tax that they had to complete. And second, they were trying to make sacrifice for the atonement of their sins through an animal sacrifice. So that's the intent of the people at the court of Gentiles. There's taxes and there's animal sacrifice. 2 things that we probably actually don't enjoy very much in theory, or probably being there wouldn't necessarily be a fun thing in some ways. And so there are vendors, there are money changers that are making a killing off these people financially at the same time. So here's the scam. Everyone had to pay their taxes, no exceptions. But the problem is the temple would only accept currency in their own coins. So like they had to exchange their money out for a temple currency. You couldn't just use your own money from wherever you came from. And so if you've ever traveled internationally before, you kind of know that feeling where you're at the airport or you're standing there at the currency exchange window and you're kind of trying to do math like for the first time in 20 years and you're like, okay, what's happening? Like, my exchange rate is what? And so at some point, you just realize to give up, and you're like, just give me the money that you're supposed to give me, and that's the deal. I guess that's fine. But in the back of your mind, you're like, I feel like I'm losing some value here, right? Like, there's this sense that you're leaving some money on the table. I feel this way anytime I go with my kids to, like, Chuck E. Cheese or Dave & Buster's, right? It's like they've heard of quarters, but it's like, no. Your quarters, your American dollars are no good here. You need these special coins, right? You need this special currency, this token to play games and so forth. And so this is what's happening in the court of Gentiles. They had to exchange their shekels, their coins, for temple currency. Not only that, but the vendors are making money off the fact that people are traveling a far away, right? They still need an animal for their sacrifice. Mark mentions pigeons, but it's likely that there's all kinds of animals in the court of Gentiles, right? You could probably get a lamb if you had enough money, or a goat, or whatever you wanted there, but the people are paying an inflated price because of supply and demand, right? Sometimes you can only afford just a pigeon. And so supply and demand, not a modern problem. We all know the frustration of supply and demand. If you've been to a ballpark in the last 20 years, right? It's like all of a sudden it costs $30 for a beer and a hot dog. Like, what is going on? Like, why does it cost that much money? Well, because they can charge that much money. If you've ever been to a movie theater, it's like popcorn costs like 25 cents to make, right? Like, and it costs us $15 for some reason to have popcorn at the movie theater. Not only that, hey, you need a camel for your ride home? We got that. Hey, you hungry for some lunch at the temple? Come over to the temple cafe. We have some shawarma. We have some kebabs for you guys. Whatever you want. Hey, you want a nice necklace to bring your daughter home from this trip? We have that for you. Magazines, chewing gum, portable phone chargers, right? Like, this is the kind of vibe that's happening in the court of Gentiles. So not even for those of us who maybe grew up in religious circles, but I think for all of us, this just kind of feels a little bit weird. Like, they're at church. They're at church about to worship, about to sacrifice this animal or pay their tax, and there's a part of this that's very spiritual and very heartfelt and worshipful, and you just kind of know in your gut, this isn't what church is for. It would kind of be like saying, hey, this is a very even mild example. Let's say we had a youth group, which we're working on, by the way, but let's say we had a youth group, and they wanted to go to campus, so we had a fundraiser, and instead of having like desserts and baked goods out in the courtyard, I decide in all my wisdom to put out 4 tables up here during church. And any time during church, you guys, I'm speaking, there's worship happening, come on up, grab a brownie, no problem, we'll just pay that right here and now. It's just weird, right? Like, just not the time and place for that type of transaction. Some of you probably like the brownie thing, actually. But so it's a misuse, right? That's the tension here. It's a misuse. Jesus is all for paying your taxes. In fact, in Mark 12, we'll get to in a few weeks, he says, give Caesar what he is due. Jesus wanted people to take part in the religious meaningfulness of atoning for sin through animal sacrifice. He was all about playing by those rules. Those are important traditions. The problem isn't what they're doing. The problem is where they're doing it. This is the court of Gentiles. And he gives 2 reasons here in verse 17. He actually quotes 2 Old Testament prophets. He quotes the prophet Isaiah 56:7, and he says, this is supposed to be a house of prayer. This place is not meant for that stuff. It's for prayer. And then he quotes Jeremiah the prophet in Jeremiah 7:11. He says, you made this into a den of robbers. Remember, he's talking to religious leaders. He's talking to the people who are in charge. He's talking to those who have authority and influence. And so these are fighting words. These are not a nice way to relate to your local leaders in the city, right? And it's aimed squarely for those people. They're the ones who are organizing this. They're the ones who know what they're doing. And so verse 18, it says that they are not happy about it. They want to destroy him. They want to kill him. This guy is out of control. He needs to be put in his place. He came in here with his own agenda. He's flipping our tables over. He's yelling at everybody. And not only that, Everybody's cheering him on. They're astonished by his teaching. They're excited about what he's doing. We are losing the people. And as I think about that's the Pharisees' response. As I think about Jesus and his response, I just want to beg the question. We see this anger, we see this fight, this vitriol in Jesus, and it begs the question, what exactly is he fighting for? That's an important question. When we see extreme emotion from Christ in this scripture, why is he so emotional? Why is he so out of character in some ways? And the answer may surprise you, because I believe what we see here is that Jesus is fighting for us. He's fighting for you and I to have access to him. Anyone who's on the outside looking in and saying, I want more of God. And he's frustrated. And he quotes from Isaiah the prophet, and he says, remember, God's heart is for the foreigner. And I'm not just talking about people from Canada or Mexico. I'm not talking about people who are like on our borders. We're talking about the Gentiles, all those outside the prevailing culture, deemed outcasts. And this is the only place in the whole temple that they can go and be with God. No matter how far away you are from God, if you're born a Jew, if you're not a born a Jew, if you don't have it all together, the temple is a place for you. And so he quotes Jeremiah and it says, you've made this a place, a den of robbers. Now, you may be thinking that that's because they're ripping people off. Well, that's probably not the point Jesus is making. Think about it. Like, thieves don't rob people in their, like, kind of home turf, right? So this is where the robbers go. Like, after Ocean's 11 happens, and they all go into this big warehouse, they're high-fiving one another, right? And everybody's, like, counting up money and splitting it up. This is where they feel at ease, a den of robbers. This is where those who are thieves show up, and they're like, hey, we're safe. And Jesus' point here is this to the religious leaders. Don't go out there, defraud people, say it's in God's name, and then kind of come back to the temple, pat yourself on the back, and think that you're safe. That's what you've done here. This is supposed to be a house of prayer, and you've made it a frat house. Jesus is angry because this is a night market now, right? Animals everywhere, stepping in poop, shouting over money. It has zero resemblance of what it's supposed to be. And so he flips the tables over. He unplugs the sound system, right? He tells everybody the party's over. I want you to feel what Jesus is feeling. I want you to feel what the Gentiles are feeling, but I also feel like there's some things here that are for us as well this morning. Do you know in your own heart the temple is the place where men and women, regardless of background, come and experience God? And so Jesus says, you Pharisees, your actions have made the temple exclusive, when in fact, my whole reason for being here is to include everybody who wants to know God more. I want to give you greater access to him. And listen, that extends to our church as well, the King's Church, here in 2023. Maybe you're here today, and there's a chance that you don't fit in this morning. Maybe you didn't know any of those worship songs. Maybe you don't know who you're sitting next to your right and left. Maybe this doesn't feel comfortable or feel like home in any ways. Maybe your background is different than the norm than everybody else here. Listen, I want you to hear that you are welcome here, that church is a place for you, and it's always been that way in the Christian faith. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to agree with everything I say, nor will we agree with everything you think, but you will always have a place here as long as you want to be here. And that's not my idea. That's what Jesus has always been about. And so it's Monday, and we see that Jesus has some very clear expectations that have gone unmet. And so that's point 2 this morning on Tuesday, the second day of the week. Number 2 is about unmet expectations. Unmet expectations. Look at verse 20. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Let's stop here. This is Tuesday morning. The guys are taking the same trail home, and they curse to Peter on the way. Hey, maybe that fig tree has gotten into shape a little bit, And that pep talk that Jesus gave to him, right, maybe those figs will show up today. And so he spots the tree, he walks up to it, and it's completely withered up. From the ground up, there is no hope for this tree. And Peter remembers, oh, wait, Jesus did this. Jesus killed this tree. Now, for those of you who may have issue with that, there's probably a lot of trees around, right? There's probably a whole grove of trees, perhaps. But this tree is no longer healthy. It's no longer alive. And now we have kind of the last top layer of our fig tree sandwich with an explanation from Jesus as well. Let's read verse 22. And Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly, I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses. I'm not sure how much the disciples understood from that. And I think even us 2,000 years later, it may go over our head as well. So let me just try to get to the gist of what's being said here in verses 22 through 25. Why did Jesus kill that tree? He killed that fig tree because he was making a point. A real-life metaphor. This fig tree represents the hypocritical religious leaders in Israel. And its demise shows the judgment that is waiting for anybody who follows in their footsteps. And so Mark does this on purpose, this fig tree sandwich kind of this technique, smashing these stories together, saying these go together, right? It's not just a matter of chronology. Jesus sees a fruit tree. He has a reasonable expectation that it has fruit on it, and it doesn't. It's actually dead inside. And Jesus simply makes the outside match with the inside. In the same way, he goes to the temple, this huge, massive place with all these courts, with all this religiosity happening behind its doors. And it's designed for God's people to encounter him. He expects the place to be full of faith and prayer and spiritual work. And that's not the case at all. It's hollow. It's misused. And judgment is coming for them too. You can almost tell, like hindsight, right, being 2020, it's so clear that Jesus is about to go to the cross. He's saying things that he's never really connected before. And in doing so, when he goes to the cross, he will abolish the need for animal sacrifice. There will be no longer any need for animals to go to the temple to have their blood spilt for you and me. And through Christ's death, he will tear the veil that separates us from the Holy of Holies. No more courts. No more, hey, you can't go that far. You might die. You might trip and fall. Like, this isn't for you. No, everyone who's called upon the name of the Lord, we all have access to God. And that includes you and I as well. You see, verses 20 through 25, they're thinking tree, right? They're thinking fig tree. But Jesus is talking about the new and better temple. Jesus points to three ways that he himself, you realize that, Christ is the new and better temple. And he himself is the greater temple. Three things that his once and for all sacrifice will provide. We see words like faith, we see confidence, and we see forgiveness. Verse 22, that we live our lives led by faith. Verse 23 and 24, that there is a confidence in the way we approach God in prayer. And verse 25, a desire, a commitment to forgive people. And he says, first off, guys, have faith. Have faith. Think about how important that message would be a couple days later to the disciples. They are about to go through some of the hardest days of their life coming up in the next week. This is going to rock these guys to the core, and Jesus reminds them of the importance of having faith. In the Old Testament, maybe you know this from reading the Psalms, moving mountains was sort of this example of doing the impossible, right? So if you want to talk about like doing something that was just outlandish, you would talk about moving mountains. But Jesus doesn't just speak about some random mountain. Look at verse 23. He says, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, which mountain? They had just left Bethany. They're on their way to Jerusalem, and the highest thing in sight is the temple. Now, he doesn't say this explicitly here, but scholars believe that the temple is the mountain he's talking about. Your faith will be tested, but I'm telling you, disciples, you are not going to need that man-made temple any longer. In fact, you can just throw that thing into the sea. My death on your behalf is the only thing you will need. And because you are saved by grace, you now have confidence. We can ask whatever we need in prayer, and we've received it. No more middlemen, no more inner court and outer court. Access to God for everyone has been made wide open. And now that we have this access to God, it directly impacts how we are to treat one another. You see, that's the thing we have to remember, Christians, is that we are not just saved, we are not just sanctified, we're not just brought into the family so that we could feel better and happier. We are saved so that we can now make an impact in our community, so that we can have a better sense of how to care and offer forgiveness for one another. Christian relationships that are not marked by grudges or vendettas, but by a desire to make the peace. I can almost imagine the disciples, and maybe some of you are thinking this the same way, like, teacher, you got all that from a dead fig tree? Like, that's a lot, right? That's quite a bit. What Jesus is describing is otherworldly for them. They had no idea in some ways what he's talking about. And for all the expectations that the fig tree and the temple failed to live up to, Jesus knew his life and death would go way beyond their hopes and dreams spiritually. No more sacrifices, no more veil, no more mediator for death. We have, all of us, complete access to God. And I hope you believe this. I hope you do. And if you do, and if you recognize the authority of the one who's speaking, the authority of Jesus, then it will go well for us. Look at verse 27. There's no verse 26, by the way, so don't look for it, okay? Don't look at it a long time. Verse 27 is all about the authority of Jesus. And they came again to Jerusalem, and he was walking in the temple. The chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them? Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Here's the question. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. And so they discussed it with one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But shall we say from man? They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. I'm struck by a number of things here in this last section that we're going to cover today. But one of the things that I find amazing is the confidence that Jesus has. He just was in the temple the day before, and he just made a mess of this place. He flipped over tables. He was yelling at people. And the next day, he is like, I wonder what's going on in the temple today. And he walks back in the same place. And Jesus knows exactly where these guys are at in relationship to him, and he doesn't shy away from it at all. He marches in, he steps right into the hornet's nest, and he confronts them. And they have this whole list of complaints, right? These guys, like, how can you do this? How can you forgive people's sins? How can you keep company of sinners, right? We've seen the people you associate with. How is that becoming of somebody in your position? How can you redefine the Sabbath? How can you come into the temple and tear up the most holy of places? How can you do that, Jesus? By what authority do you do these things? And so Christ answers their question with a question, which is kind of this back and forth thing that happened often. That's how they rolled back then. And he basically asks, what's your take on my cousin John? Was he a godly prophet, or was he just a crazy guy in the wilderness? What are your thoughts on John? And so they begin to discuss with themselves. And it's funny because the word that's used here, disgust, is always what people do when they're trying to get out of an issue with Jesus, right? Like, The guys are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so they go through it. John the Baptist, good dude, right? Now, has he come from God? I'm not sure. John the Baptist baptized Jesus. John the Baptist said that he is greater than me. So what's our official position on John the Baptist? Well, the problem for these guys is this. If we say John the Baptist is from heaven, then we need to accept Christ as legit. We need to accept Jesus as legitimate. But if we say that he's just the dude, tons of people are going to be mad at us. They're going to be frustrated because they hold to the fact that John the Baptist is an amazing prophet. And John was beheaded and murdered, and that only made his cause more sympathetic. And so they kind of say, we don't know. We're not sure. We don't know how to answer your question, Jesus. Sorry. And so Jesus very mysteriously responds, well, I guess we'll never know. Now the question is, why didn't Jesus just tell them? I got to be honest. I'm not sure. There's a sense of timing here. He still has 3-4 more days in the week that he has to accomplish some things. But my guess is this. Much like us, Jesus didn't like being set up. Jesus knew they wanted to kill him, and Jesus knew that they wanted to hear him say, I do all these things by my authority because I'm God. And that would be it. But it was only Tuesday, and they had to get all the way to Friday and the cross. As we close this morning, I want to remind you that our humility, as we approach the authority of Jesus, it matters. How do you relate to God? How do you relate to Christ? I think we have different pictures of how we relate to Jesus, and maybe I would just encourage you, if it is too far leaning towards, man, Jesus is my buddy, he's my homie, he's my friend. That's how I relate to Jesus. And if we forget that he is the God of the universe, that he will not be entrapped, man, the disposition of our heart, it matters. And so if you come on bended knee, and if you are truly seeking, I believe you will find, when you knock on that door, it will be opened. When you come to the altar in humility, he will meet you there. This was a lesson that was lost in the Pharisees, and so I just want to encourage you to not make that same mistake this morning. Do you need to be reminded this morning of the authority of Christ in your life? Is your whole life opened up to be submissive to him? Church, confess him for who he is. Ask him for forgiveness. Ask him for purpose and for direction, and say, I will follow you whatever you say. Jesus cleared the temple out so you and I can have access to God, and he'll die on the cross in 4 days so that we could rely on his work instead of our own. So let's submit to his authority, his lordship together. Let's bow our heads together and ask God to help us with this. God, we're grateful for this reminder. We're grateful that you saw it fit to give us these images of the temple, of this fig tree, and Lord, that we could sit kind of in the back row and hear this lesson you're teaching the disciples. God, I pray that lesson would not be lost on us this morning. That we would see you for who you are, that we would be eager to hear your voice of authority in our lives, realizing that you don't want to crush us. You're not going to blast us away with your supreme power. Lord, you love us, and you want us to submit humbly to you. And so, God, there are people maybe in this room this morning who are living in such a way where either one, they're far from you and never have thought about even submitting to your authority. Or more likely, Lord, there are people who just have kind of been living on their own for a long time, doing their own thing. At some point, we submitted, we bend the knee, but Lord, if we're honest, if we look back at our life the last few weeks, we have lived and done so much without any sense of submitting to you and what you want from us. And so, God, I pray that there would be a fresh start in that posture this morning, that we would see you clearly as God, that we'd be reminded of the work that you did on the cross for us. And it would result in submission, but also, in a greater way, it would result in worship. God, we love you and ask for your help in those ways. We praise your name. Amen.